We might get started. Thanks everyone for joining us. For some of us, it's been a long time coming, coming together in this way. If you registered originally for the workshop that's now been rescheduled multiple times, thank goodness we're finally here. So before we get started, I would just like to acknowledge that I'm at least joining you from the lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people. And I know we have some others from different jurisdictions and from different places in WA. I just want to pay my respects to elders past and present, acknowledge that the lands of Aboriginal people were unceded, and also just say, you know, we do a lot of work with Aboriginal social enterprises in our work at Impact Seed, and I'm constantly surprised and awed at the resilience of Aboriginal culture, and so we're very lucky to work with them, and I'm glad that this COVID environment we've been able to hopefully protect the elders as much as possible. So we're here today to talk about impact measurement or management for an organisational setting, and so some of you might be not-for-profit, some of you might be social enterprises. I have a couple of things I want to mention straight off the bat. So first of all, Zoom etiquette, great to see. I think most of you already know what you're doing. So if you keep your microphone muted unless you're speaking, that's awesome. If you keep your video on so that we can see you here, and if I'm asking questions, I can see nods or shaking of heads, that's great. If you have a question, I've tried to make time for questions, and so make it a bit flexy this afternoon. So if you do want to ask a question, if you write it in the chat, I'll keep an eye on that. But equally, I'll try and keep an eye on your wonderful faces too. So you can try raising a hand. Hopefully I'll see it. It is part one of a two-part kind of structure that we put together for talking about this topic. The second one will hopefully be face-to-face at some point in the future, and I'll just make sure those details are provided for you all. You also know, and some of you joined me this morning as well, we tried to delineate, and I'm not saying we made a perfect distinction, but between corporates and organisations looking to measure things in a corporate setting, including the measurement of their investments as, you know, corporate investment, through to, hey, I'm just trying to measure the impact of my organisation, be it a not-for-profit or social enterprise. Is honestly, you know, easy links to make between the two, and it's not an easy distinction to make, but we did our best. But that if you are joining again, welcome again, but also there is some content that's the same, particularly in terms of framing outcomes concepts. I use similar language to do that. I just want to invite you to think about this workshop and the kinds of concepts and things we'll go through as just one element of developing your practice of impact measurement or management. And I'll talk about the distinction of those two things in a bit. I think often we can come to things and think, hey, like this is going to be my golden bullet, right? Or golden ticket, or whatever the right analogy is there. And we think this is going to be the answer to how I can measure outcomes. And the fact is there's no one way of doing it. And I think everything, as with many other things in life, it's a practice and something that all we can do is try to develop over time as best we can. So hopefully there's some elements here, some bits and pieces that you can pull from, things you might not have known before, things that hopefully help deepen your understanding of things you might have already known. And the questions, great. So yeah, please do ask questions. I certainly have less slides in this deck than I did in the last, but I also planned an activity. So we'll see how we go for time, but please do feel free to ask questions throughout. Okay. Oh, and I also have my colleague Emma Tompkinson on the call too. So yep, she's waving there. So Emma often delivers this with me when we're in person. So although I guess most of the stuff we'll go through today will be me driving. If there's any questions that come up, and if there's little pieces where I know Emma adds value, she'll kind of pipe up and we'll weave her in. But if you've got any questions, Emma might be able to have a look at those in the chat as well. Okay, so a little bit about Impact Seed for those that might not be aware. So we are an organisation committed to building the impact investment and social enterprise markets in Western Australia. And a critical element of that is outcomes measurement or impact measurement. Obviously, you know, we can't have impact investment and social enterprise, which are these concepts of how do we combine, I guess, business as usual with with, you know, creating good social impact at the same time, we can't have the impact bit if we don't know how to measure it. And so that's why impact measurement takes up quite a bit of the work that we do at Impact Seed. So in terms of what I'm hoping to go through this afternoon, so, you know, we've kind of done some welcoming remarks, and there's, yep, great, there's still a couple of people coming in. Sorry if I pause, I'm just adding them from the waiting room. So we'll talk a bit about the language of impact measurement and management and that distinction. We'll talk about how we decide on the kinds of outcomes that we want to use, and how we choose indicators to illustrate those outcomes. Then we'll talk a bit about how we actually measure change in those indicators and some of the tools and methodologies that we use to measure change. And then finally, we'll talk a bit about how we might organise our outcomes and indicators. So using some of the different outcomes measurement frameworks that exist and how some of those might be applicable for your work. And hopefully questions, hopefully questions. Okay, so in terms of definitions and introductory concepts, what I'd actually like to do is, if I can, just pop you into smaller rooms just to talk a bit about your understanding of outcomes and where you're currently sitting and what you're hoping to get out of this session. So what I'm going to do now is use breakout rooms. And so what the Zoom will do is automatically populate you into separate rooms with a smaller number of people. We'll have, you know, sort of a 5 to 6 minute introduction and conversation about your understanding of the definitional kind of things around outcomes, and then I'll pull you back in. So I'm going to send you off now.
Kind of key soapbox issue is outputs versus outcomes. Lots of my corporate clients don't understand the difference, and some are always, you know, looking for different ways to really help them develop that knowledge, and me too.
Great.
Want to go, Megan?
Oh, okay. I'm similar. I'm a consultant as well, and worked a lot in the not-for-profit community, community development type stuff, but also in the arts. So been working more in the kind of philanthropic space. I've only just come into consulting again after being in a CEO role for the last 3 years. And at the moment, I'm just refreshing, my knowledge and understanding of impact measurement. So I've done bits and pieces across the way, but I'm particularly interested in that philanthropic relationship. I was when I enrolled in the workshop. I don't know about now. It was a while ago, so I've forgotten. I'd actually forgotten why I was here.
That happens. Are you in WA, Megan, or no?
Yes. Yeah.
I'm sorry, Max. I probably missed your introduction.
Oh no, that's okay. So my name's Max. I'm working in a strategic kind of position for a fairly young Aboriginal company based in Perth. It's got a footprint in Perth and in the Wheatbelt, WA Wheatbelt. So I'm always been really interested in measuring anything that we do, because that's the leverage that we get for further investment from anyone. And, you know, I've been in a bunch of different contexts and different roles over the last 10 years that look at it differently. I've been a part of discourse, you know, at kind of state level, where with not-for-profits, where they're kind of trying to change the whole landscape, and often it's a lot of discourse and not much measurement going on, and a lot of confusion or inconsistency around how you measure outcomes versus outputs. And it's really difficult to measure outcomes, actually, particularly when you're moving into say, for example, an Aboriginal space. So, yeah, I'm just here to learn anything I possibly can, because I want to make sure that we embed evaluation and outcomes measurements as deeply as possible in what we do, and just learn as we go.
Yeah, that's great.
Great. So are you recording this? I just noticed the recording thing.
Oh, probably because I'm here, but I really only record it for, posterity purposes.
Yeah.
But yeah, usually you wouldn't be recorded in the breakout rooms. I think you're lucky, because I'm all right, I'm going to pop back out, but I'm going to pull everyone back in a moment. So I'll start in a second. Hi, Joe. We're just in breakout rooms at the moment, so they should be back soon.
Sorry, I was in another meeting and it ran over time.
Yeah, no worries. Good. Oh, good. Okay, everyone should be coming back to join us now.
Oh, great. Thank you. I'll just remute myself.
Okay, hopefully you guys are all coming back again. Yeah, looks like it. So, does anyone want to share some of the conversation that I gave you in probably the all too brief time? No.
I'll have a go. There was a reasonably common theme for a couple of us at least around not exactly knowing and being quite early in our journey around defining and understanding and measuring and sort of understanding how that conversation and process goes.
Great. I think that's probably not uncommon for those of us that feel familiar with outcomes. It's still an ongoing journey. Any others?
I suppose one of the things that came up quite briefly for us was the link between complexity and outcomes. And, outcomes for individuals can be, diverse, huge in range. But as I think Emma said at the end there, sometimes for a bank, it was a single one-liner. That's what they achieved, keeping businesses open, full stop. That's the outcome, not what the businesses did and so on. So it's, complexity, outcome, but, where do you pitch the statement of what you're trying to achieve?
Totally. I think in human services in particular, our outcomes are wildly complex. Any others? No? Okay.
One of the things we spoke about was the ability to, because for any kind of outcomes measurement, really, it's in my mind anyway at this stage, it's about long-term change, long-term sustainable change. So one of the challenges we face is to be able to do that consistently over a long period of time. And then, there's the usual thing about allocation of resources and continuity of knowledge and the ability to actually measure that long term, with its, depending on, whatever it is, whether it's complex or particularly if it's complex, because I'm in social, I think we're all in the social service space more or less. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, and I think a lot of that tension is tension that we have to hold in the practice that we do, and so it's a matter of figuring out what's important to us, what's the shared understanding we have with the people who we're trying to measure things for or with or whatever it is, and like Mike's point, how do we articulate it, and then how do we I guess use our resources in the best possible way to do that. But it's not always clear, and I think that's part of the messiness, is that outcomes measurement is so highly contextual, and depending on what it is we're trying to measure will dictate the how, the resources, and all of the other things, although sometimes resources dictate how much we can measure as well, so it's important to be realistic about that. Okay, I will keep us moving on, but thanks for that. I quite like breakout rooms. It's a nice way to just connect with a couple of people in a larger call. So, okay, so this will be familiar to some of you, and some of you on the start of your outcomes journey, it might be a little bit newer, but this is what we call a program logic model. Some people call it a theory of change as well, but it's effectively a framework, a way of organising outcomes, and a way of, I guess, articulating them in a language that's generally pretty acceptable in the outcomes measurement area. So there was a survey done. No, this is a bit more impact investy, but there was a survey done of a bunch of international impact investors about what methodologies and tools they preferred to use in measuring outcomes, and they stated that most of them, regardless of the tool, use that common language of input, activity, output, outcome. So for those of you who this is slightly newer for, I'm just going to talk through some key elements of it. So from my perspective, I really like to start over on the right hand side, so the outcome and impact, the yellow pieces. So if we think about impact or long-term outcome, what is the thing in the world that we're trying to achieve? It's kind of the thing that relates to the vision or mission of the organisation, right? It's these big picture social, environmental, economic type outcomes. I say big like that. Sometimes it may not be. It might be smaller, but it's so contextual depending on what we're measuring. Anyway, we've got the long-term outcomes or impacts. The step before that, the medium-term outcomes, here we're asking ourselves, well, in order to get to that long-term outcome and impact, what are the behaviour changes, the actions, the policy environment? What are the things that have to be doing things differently for us to get to that long-term picture? So if we take a step further back from that to the short-term outcomes, in order to get to those actions, what are the changes that need to happen in people's awareness, their understanding, their knowledge, their opinions, their attitudes? What are those kinds of shifts that need to occur for us to get to those behavioural action type shifts, for us to then get to the long-term outcomes or impacts? And for me, that distinction between short, medium and long-term outcome is really important. I say for me, I don't think that's true. I think for the entire sector, for this entire space, because it gives us a frame of reference to start to chunk down the very big, complex, system level things I think we're trying to all achieve in the kinds of organisations we're in. So then if we work backwards from that, then we've got the outputs. So what are those, and I just want to note here that this particular model puts activities under outputs. Not all of them do that. So sometimes it looks like inputs, activities, and then outputs. But what are the things that happen as a result of doing things? So whatever our activity is, here we've got meetings, counselling sessions. For some of you, it might be delivering particular kinds of programs or services, providing accommodation, whatever it is. What is a result of those things that we do? Is it X number of people attended? We reached X number of customers. There was this kind of satisfaction. The outputs sorts of things, the things that happen as an immediate result of the activities. And then from there, we can measure what the short, medium and long-term outcomes are. there's always an interplay here with assumptions, with external factors, and other things. But from my perspective, that logic and that articulation between short, medium, and long-term outcome, and then in terms of output, knowing that outputs are the step along the way, the thing that helps us understand outcomes, and then knowing the activities could be an output, or it might be the thing that comes before the output, right? So it's the logic, and I guess that's why it's called a program logic model, right? The theory of change, although these terms are kind of used interchangeably, the theory of change really is the thing that, and ideally is evidence-based, that tells us that why is it that if we apply our resources in this kind of way, with these kinds of activities, do we get these kind of outputs? And why is it that we know that if we have these kinds of outputs, that we have these sorts of short-term outcomes, which lead to these medium-term outcomes, which lead to these long-term outcomes. So it's the thing that underpins the logic model, right? It's the theory of change. It's your theory of why change happens when you apply resources in this kind of way. Acknowledging that, sometimes the terms are used interchangeably, I kind of like to make the distinction there, because I think what separating program logic out from theory of change does is actually help you to be clear on what is your theory of change. So why is it that you deploy your resources in these kinds of ways? Any questions on that? So if we then think about, this is just the outputs and outcomes part of the program logic. If we then think about the fact that we've got participation as usually an output, so the number of people that have been reached, what kind of intensity of contact we had with those people, through to the engagement and learning side. So that's the short-term outcomes. So what actually happened as a result of, the outputs that you undertook, through to the action and impact, so the longer-term outcomes. So if we kind of think about how we delineate those, we've got the learning ones, the knowledge, the skills, and the attitude. And then for the action and impact, the longer-term effects on the individual. What we're really actually interested in is the change in these things, right? So we want to understand, where were we before we started delivering our program or service or intervention or whatever it is, and where are we as a result of delivering the program, service, whatever. The challenge, I suppose, that we have is getting an effective baseline. So often as community service organisations, we're not going to make sure that this person who's in distress in front of us answers a series of questions about their mental health before we provide them with the service that they need, right? That's not something that community service organisations do. So having an accurate baseline sometimes can be challenging. And the counterfactual just refers to this idea of what would have happened otherwise. So acknowledging that humans are resilient, and that humans generally, can find ways around things. What would they have done if your service or program or organisation didn't exist? And often we say, well, they just wouldn't have been able to get the support. And possibly that's true, but it's also possible that they would have found something else, albeit not as good, but might have found something else to fill the void that your program or service or whatever filled. So these elements are the actual, I guess, the crux of outcomes measurement, and they're the really kind of hard things to understand. Sorry, probably should have put this on first. So outcomes as an analogy to cake, which, it's harder on here because I can see a little bit of your faces, but often people really like this analogy, right? We like the analogy to cake. So this idea of the inputs being the ingredients, the utensils, the recipe, and the inputs in a project sense being time, money, resources. The activities being the baking, the mixing, the slicing, the dicing, and the activities being counselling sessions in the project-based example. The output then is cake. We've got cake for 10 people as a result of deploying our resources in those certain ways and applying those activities to our resources. We've got cake. In the project example, we've got 10 people have received counselling. And so the outcome then is that people are full and happy. So it's a result of having the output. And in the counselling sense, 10 people are happy, confident, and healthy. So it's kind of a simple, like I know it's simple and it's simplifying something that, as we've just described in the introductions, is actually quite complex in a human services setting. But I think for people just starting out sometimes on their outcomes measurement journey, and, you know, particularly for clients when we're trying to ask data of the people that we're working with, and we want to explain to them why it's important and why we want to get into this distinction between outputs and outcomes, I think the cake slide can sometimes be useful for that. So I didn't mention at the beginning, I will make the slides available to you afterwards. So, you know, you can use the cake slide in your own work. I think the other thing that's critical to note when we're talking outcomes is that the context is important. And I think oftentimes this debate about, oh, we're talking about, no, that's an output, not an outcome, or, you know, whatever it is. Often that debate can come because I don't think we've got a shared understanding of what context we're operating in. So in terms of individual outcomes, these are the outcomes that people want for their own lives, right? And sometimes they're not the kinds of outcomes that government or even we as community services are trying to measure or understand. So you've got outcomes at an individual level. We've got outcomes at a program, service, or organisational level. And whether if you guys are from larger organisations, you can have programs and services underneath your org. And then if we think about it from a government perspective, they've obviously got programs and services which involve multiple organisations. So you've got a couple of different ways to slice and dice that level, but an aggregate of outcome effectively, and then community or population level outcomes. So, you know, what are we looking for in terms of, I don't know, the provision of, you know, what kind of, sorry, got some more people joining us. So what are we looking at in terms of people with mental health challenges in the Shire of Serpentine Jarrahdale? Or, you know, what are we looking at in terms of people, housing for people with a disability in Broome, or, you know, whatever it is at a community or population level, that we can be talking about outcomes as well. I think sometimes we can mix up the contexts. So, you know, individual outcomes in and of themselves might actually be an indicator or an output for a population level outcome, or maybe a program or service or organisational level outcome might be a short or medium term outcome on the way to a long-term outcome. But I think the ordering and the understanding of where we're at, sometimes we don't spend enough time on that, you know, on the understanding the context of specifically what we're talking about before we start talking outcomes. And that can be challenging. Okay, so we're going to try an activity now. So this is going to be interesting. So I'm going to, I should have sent it to you in advance, but I didn't. So hopefully you can see the Logic Model Lingo PDF that I've popped up on the side here. So what I want to do is just spend a couple of minutes going through each of these. So as you can see, what the activity is asking you to do is kind of put a number next to each of these. I know you can't because I haven't sent it to you, so you don't have it in front of you. But if you've got a piece of paper or a Word doc you can bring up and just sort of put a list of numbers down, that would be great. So whether each of these is an input, an output, an outcome, and if it's an outcome, is it a short term, so a learning oriented outcome? Is it a medium term, so an action oriented outcome? And is it a long term outcome? So I'm going to just give probably, just see if, as far as you get. I've only put down to here in the on the screen. I don't expect that we get through all of them. I just thought we'd do a few to see where we get to. So I'll just give you 2 minutes to do that. To those that just joined us, we're just going through an exercise at the moment. So you'll see in my screen share, we've got a logic model lingo exercise. That's an oldie but a goodie. So we're just going through and trying, and I'm just realizing now you won't be able to do this unless you have a knowledge of program logic, but we're just numbering each of the elements in the exercise. So that's why we're silent at the moment. Where are we up to? Does anyone want to type in the chat where you're up to? It just gives us a sense of how much longer.
It's Erin. I'm up to
Erin.
F. I
Cool.
find it challenging.
F. All right, good.
B. Okay. Oh gosh, I'm going to go back and concentrate.
Yeah, that's right. Clearly, Erin, you're falling behind here. All right. Sorry. We might just get down to, let's get down to Q. Let's go to Q. It's not a race, but if people can start to let me know when they've gotten to Q, that would be useful. Cool, we've got a couple getting there. I often, when I do this exercise in workshops, we do it in smaller groups, and I actually think probably the point of the exercise is better served doing it in groups, but we'll just see how we go here. All right, so for those that are still finishing off, just finish off, but I might start with A, so teens learn new leadership skills. So I'm wondering how best to do this. Maybe or a smallish enough group, right? Maybe someone can just unmute and let me know where you got to. So what do we think for teens learned new leadership skills? Or if we're more comfortable, we can type it in the chat.
Or 3A maybe?
3A? Yep. Any others? Other answers? No? Okay. 3A is the correct answer, but kind of one of the points of this exercise is often people come to the table with different answers, and so usually we have a bit of discussion. But yes, on the sheet I have in front of me, it's the correct answer, and I'll make that available to you all too, because I think it's a useful exercise for you to do with your own teams too. B, a new curriculum was developed.
Can I say it depends on what logic model you're looking at?
Yeah. Yep. Exactly. So is the new curriculum being developed? Yes. So I've got a couple who are putting 2 in there. That is the correct answer. But I think the point that Craig's making is if you actually think about is a new curriculum being developed actually, you know, a piece of the system? Is it like a policy or something that's going to shift? And so actually it's an outcome of what you're trying to achieve? Or is the new curriculum an input into what it is you're trying to do? So a new curriculum could actually fit in a few different circumstances. We don't have the knowledge around this program to know what it's trying to do. What about students reported increased confidence in negotiation skills?
So that was a 3B.
Yep. Others?
I had 3A.
Great. So yeah, that's what we like. So the official record says 3A. So an increase in confidence in negotiation skills. So there's probably a knowledge, understanding, learning shift before the enacting of the negotiation skills. But you can absolutely see how it could be seen as, well, if they've got increased confidence, they must have been you know, engaging with their negotiation skills, right? What about the next one? Training programs included seminars and workshops.
2.
Yep, 2. Any others? Because 2 and a 1 there. Yeah, so the answer we've got here is 2, so it's an output. But again, you can see how that training program could actually be an input to what's being achieved. And yeah, well, probably just 1 and 2. I can't quite extrapolate to outcome in this case. Sometimes I like to test, you know, intellectually, you know, see if we can get there. But yeah, so it could be 1 or 2. I think that one. Parents from around the state attended.
Output.
2s. Yep. So 2 is again what we've got here. But in terms of parents from around the state attended, once again, what is the purpose? Is parents attending an input into the program? Is actually parents attending at all? Like if you're working with really challenging to contact and work with parents, maybe parents actually attending is actually a kind of short-term outcome for you. You know, and having it actually just increase contact with parents is important. So again, depends on the context, right? Where are we at? We just do a couple more. Operators applied their new skills on the job. F.
Possibly a 3A.
Yep, good. So 3A, 3B, 2, 3A. Yep, so they're all good responses. The official answer is 3B. So the application of new skills. So there's an action being taken. But you can absolutely see how, you know, like in what order are you thinking about that, right? So, you know, applying new skills on the job, is that still a form of learning outcome? And really, it depends on the purpose. We need the context of the program and what it's trying to achieve to help us, you know, kind of order these things in our brains. So I might stop it there, but I will make the answers available to you all and the activity, because I think it is a really good example of actually how contextual these things are. And when we're talking outcomes measurement, it's really a common understanding between, you know, me as whatever I'm measuring and you as the stakeholder in what I'm measuring, whether you be a funder or a client or project partner. We have to be really clear on what it is we're measuring and why, so that we can have the common understanding of what we're even measuring to start with, right? But yeah, it's a good one for teams. I would just say that. Let me bring back my PowerPoint. Okay, great. So thanks everyone for engaging in that. That's really nice. It's nice to have some, you know, back and forth on these things. Otherwise it's just me talking to myself, right? Okay. So in terms of measuring change, so here's some tools and frameworks to think about how we might measure change. Sorry, I have some statements about that before we go straight into that. So in terms of taking an outcome and thinking about the indicators or measures that we attach to it, this is just the point I made before about how impact investors at least are keen to use that same language and that terminology of outputs, outcomes and impacts, regardless of the kind of tool or framework that they are actually using. So from an, you know, and this is a very high level kind of pass, right? But if we're thinking about outcomes and how we might attach indicators to them, I've just kind of put a sense of how many indicators could be useful to attach to each kind of outcome that we're trying to understand. So actually I won't go through that in any detail, but if for each outcome we have specific indicators, so we know what the indicators and measures are that can help us see what's happening with that outcome. If we've got a performance target for each indicator, although, you know, technically probably not absolutely necessary, but, you know, is useful to have a goal. If we've got a data source or more than one, so we know where we can get the information from to help us understand what's happening with that outcome. And that can be one of the trickiest things that sometimes can reframe what our measurement strategy is. But I don't think we should be driven by it. And we should really think about what we want to know, but acknowledging that often we have constraints about the kind of data we have access to. And then a plan to collect the data. So if we've got those things in place, I mean, really, we don't necessarily need to have a particular kind of, methodology or, tool. We can kind of get a sense in a sort of quick and dirty way of what's happening with our outcomes, by kind of creating our own adventure, right? Choose your own adventure in terms of outcomes. And this is a slide that is going to speak a little bit, and I'm going to get Emma to speak to it actually, but this one speaks to how we actually see change moving in the indicators. They're kind of not levels of evidence exactly, but kind of different thresholds for understanding what shift is actually happening in an indicator. So Emma, do you want to speak to this one a bit?
Yes, thanks, Kylie. Sure. So one of the things that we want to know when we're measuring change is, did we cause the change that we see? So sometimes we just say, like we just count things or we see change. But other times we like to introduce a comparison, or what is sometimes called a counterfactual, which is some kind of measure by which we can sort of compare what the observed change in the people in the particular cohort we're measuring. So in this pyramid, what you're looking at is it's a kind of a hierarchy of evidence. So this was taken in particular from social impact bonds, which are outcome-based contracts. But it does have wider implications. So if we look at the bottom, that's where there's no comparison. So that's where you say, okay, we had 5 people enter employment. That's the outcome of the service. And we don't talk about what would have happened if a service didn't exist. The next level up is the historical baseline. So this is where we say, generally 60% of our people enter employment. After we introduced our mental health support worker, we found that increased to 70%. Historical baselines are more appropriate sometime in some cases than others. They're probably the ones we sort of use most in our lives. Like my baby wasn't sleeping through the night and then I gave it this medicine and now we get 12 hours sleep every night. That kind of thing it's very natural for us. So the next one up is propensity score matching. And this is where we say, we've got the people in our cohort and we say they are like some other people. And we have this other, like a control group. And we look at what happened in another group that is like our group. And we say the difference between them is the difference the program made. And then what some people call the gold standard, which is the randomized control trial. So this is how, probably the most common thing to think of is how drugs are tested. Where you have some people who have been selected to be part of a drug trial. Some of them receive the drug and some of them receive something that looks like the drug but is actually bicarb soda. Everybody feels the same, they're delivered by the same people, the settings are the same, and we see, do the people who had the drug are they different from those who did not? Some people say this is almost impossible to do in a social service setting, but a good way to think about it is most programs have some kind of rollout. And instead of rolling out in the order you always do it in, if you even randomise the places that you're rolling something out, you almost have a comparison from the places that haven't had the program rolled out yet. I don't think NDIS has rolled out with this kind of measurement rigour, but it would be great to see that happening. So back to you, Kylie.
Thanks, Emma. I think it's really useful to think about that differentiation. I think like a lot of the time, and I know even in my own practice, you know, sometimes there is just no comparison, right? And it's not, I mean, it's usually a lack of resources or a lack of understanding or sometimes a lack of data. The point I just wanted to make there is that I think we can't shy away from measuring just because we can't find a comparison. And so it's a matter of what kinds of assumptions are we making, and being really transparent about those assumptions that we're making, so that, you know, when evidence does come to light, or whether, you know, there are additional resources available, we can be going back to go, okay, yeah, like how can I tighten this bit up a bit, and how can I, you know, where can I make my comparison better than it was before. I like that example, Emma. I haven't heard that one before. If you roll out, you know, in different places, if the, you know, program has capacity to do that, you kind of do have a rolling comparison in a sense. That's really cool. Okay, so there's no one way necessarily of measuring, and I kind of alluded to that at the beginning, but there's a bunch of different ways that can be useful, and I guess the principles and the elements of them can be useful based on where you're at. And so this slide's a little bit more impact investing focused, but I think it's generally pretty applicable. So what this is saying is, for the different kinds of tools, methodologies, frameworks, whatever we call them, they're useful at different points of project planning cycle. So for example, the logic model, which we've just gone through, it's kind of, as you see, there's nothing on theory of change because it's not, you know, in a sense, technically its own thing. But with logic model, unless you attach things like indicators and have a sense of where you're collecting data for those indicators, which you're attaching to your outcomes, a logic model can help you articulate impact. It can help you maybe think about, estimate the impact before you start a project, and it can help you it can help you plan impact, but it can't really monitor or evaluate unless you attach those extra things to your logic model. Similarly with social return on investment, or SROI, the first one in this diagram, you can use it for estimating impact. So I'll go through SROI and what it does in a moment, and this might make more sense then. And you can use it for monitoring and evaluating impact, but you can't really use it for planning impact. It's just not the kind of tool that you can use to do that. And equally, if we pop down to the bottom to the quasi-experimental methods, which Emma just spoke to, those guys are pretty good at estimating impact. So, you know, that's the research. So we know from the research that's been done with these kinds of methods, you know, what that's probably likely to lead to. And that can obviously evaluate, but you can't really plan or monitor impact with those kinds of methods. So it's just useful to know that different things are going to be useful at different points of the project, you know, kind of cycle or service cycle. And so it's not just a matter of, you know, okay, I'm going to choose SROI and I can use that to, you know, measure my program to the end of time. Like it's not quite how that rolls out. So have people heard of social return on investment? Yeah, it's quite a sexy one. People really like SROI. So SROI, for those that don't know, is effectively a tool that takes the kind of value across the project, both intangible and intangible, and gives you a dollar value at the end of it. So effectively what you get with an SROI is, for every dollar that you've invested into this program, you've received, like $4.60 in social return. And I've actually got one to show you. So let's see how we go. Yes. So, and this is a super old, I actually think I did this as part of doing my grad cert of social impact at UWA, like probably 8 or 9 years ago. So it's pretty old. But I think it's kind of gives you a sense of what it looks like, because I think SROI, you know, we can talk about the principles and how you apply it, but until you kind of see what it looks like, and I'll just zoom in a bit there, it's hard to kind of conceive of what it is. So the idea is that you document all of the kinds of changes that have been seen for stakeholders, right? And the point is that you actually, the thing I quite like about SROI is that you interview people who've been impacted, so the clients, the actual people using the program or service or organisation, until you've heard everything, all of the impacts that they have had and experienced as a result of engaging. So I really like that it's driven almost completely. It's not really about what you thought, what outcomes you thought that you would create, it's driven almost completely by what, what the people are telling you that happened for them, which is cool. And so then we do some things around attaching. So we consider inputs. We think about, we think about what the outcomes were, and you have a bit of a description of what those outcomes were. And so then we think about, okay, well, what indicators can we attach to those kinds of outcomes? We eventually get to a point, sorry, I don't know why this is stuck here, the screen. And so then we get to a point where we're trying to apply financial proxies to those outcomes, right? So these sort of indicators that were happening, we attach a financial proxy to it. And that's kind of the point. You have to kind of create a financial proxy. And then you come up with a value. And then I'm just going to go to this end. The tool itself kind of estimates these things. So what would have happened without the activity? What activity did you displace? Who else contributed to the change? Does the outcome drop off eventually? So it's, there's equations behind it that do that. And then you eventually come up with an amount, which gets you to a dollar value. So it's quite technical. It's I personally have some challenges related to making everything that we do into a dollar value. However, the dollar is, I guess, the one consistent the one consistent measure, in a sense, that we have as a human race, and that probably tells us other things about us as a human race. But that's such as it is. Jenny, I'm not sure I understand your question. How does it work for animals who aren't Mr. Ed?
You said interviewing all of the stakeholders, and I'm thinking of...
Oh, yes, so people who...
The whales, and I'm fairly certain they're not going to tell us how it's going.
Yes, very good point. And so you probably wouldn't use SROI in that context. And similarly, you can. The thing with SROI also is that it's really clear about what the assumptions are and being transparent about those. So I think if you were to use it in a context where, whether it's animals, whether it's environment, or whether it's potentially, people that can't articulate necessarily to you what the change has been for them, you could definitely still make assumptions and just be clear that you're making assumptions and what those assumptions are. How do we determine the dollar value? Sorry, Chloe, so can we share this? This one, I'm just not 100% sure if I can share it just because of the circumstances that I did it in. And I'm just not sure. I'll have a think about it. I will share with you a spreadsheet, whether it's the one that's populated. I'm not sure if I can do that, but I will share with you an SRI spreadsheet so you have one. Determining the dollar value. Claire, yeah, so the dollar value, it comes as a result of all of the equations, but effectively the value, we have to input values, right, based on the financial proxy. So I'm trying to find it again. So for example, with this, oh, it's so long ago now, I'm trying to get my head back into it. Okay, this one's an easier one to describe. So here, the second line, we're talking about increased mental health and well-being, right? And so the financial proxy that has been attached to that is the cost of counselling sessions. So if there's better mental health and well-being, the assumption is that then this money is not having to be spent on additional counselling sessions. What's the value? So there's a value attached to it, etc. So this is kind of the point with SROI. You have to be able to make almost everything attached to a financial proxy. And I guess that comes back to my reservation about this as a methodology. A reminder of CBA and SROI. Cost benefit analysis. So SROI is just a form of cost benefit analysis. If I try and make a distinction between small letters SROI and big letters SROI. So SROI, big letters, capitalized letters, is a particular kind of tool and approach. Small letters SROI, social return on investment, and cost benefit analysis actually refer to a whole kind of suite of different ways of doing this kind of work. So that, it's just one of these kinds of things. Mostly larger orgs that use SROI. Sorry, Heidi, it's enough. Is it mostly large orgs? No. So I've actually seen some organisations or programs that are looking for philanthropic funding, or the philanthropic funder has asked for them to use SROI. It is a costly, because I mean, you kind of have to get a consultant in to do SROI. You could do it internally, but as you can see, it's kind of technical. So it's more of a costly tool. So in that sense, the resources are required, but I've seen smaller orgs who have the resources because of philanthropic funding or whatever use it as well. And how does ABC fit in? I might need help on that one, Craig. ABC. Activity-based costing, yeah. Not in this one, but I think when we're talking about activity-based costing, and I might make a little leap there then to outcomes-based payments, like payment by outcomes, because I think there's the activity-based side of things, but then there's also, you know, when we're paying by outcomes. I think there's probably other methodologies to use for those, and when we look at the pay for performance type contracts, so the social impact bonds that Emma alluded to before, they use kind of, I think, the principles of SROI, but they don't always necessarily like drill everything right down to a dollar value. So they're a little bit more not free, but kind of free to like frame the social outcomes around what they want to in language that is not a dollar value. So I think that that's useful. And, you know, from my perspective, you know, I prefer that, right?
I guess it's more on the other side, on the inputs and everything for activity-based costing. It's looking at the cost of every input.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I misunderstood. Yep.
Like comparing different hospitals that are both performing a tender, whatever it is. I'm not a health person.
Yeah, no.
Or they take your appendix out.
Yeah, for sure.
They'll look at all those different.
Yeah, and I think it does actually consider that. You're right, there is a connection, because if we go back to this, in terms of the inputs and valuing the inputs that are in here as well, there is a link with activity-based costing, absolutely, yeah. If assumptions of dollar value rest on client feedback, wouldn't the system methodology of feedback be key in evidence logic? Yes, yeah. So, well, kind of. So the dollar value, so usually all of the information comes from the stakeholders, and the attribution of a dollar value is kind of done behind the scenes, right? So it's the consultant or whoever's running the SROI analysis going through and applying a financial proxy. So, wouldn't the feedback be key in evidencing? I'm not sure I understand the second part of that question. Max, do you want to unmute?
Yeah, I'm just thinking, unless you kind of demonstrate the system of feedback, like what's being asked, how it's being asked, and the method of collection and collation, then there's a kind of big assumption just in what is kind of how that's, you know, put in the first place to go on and fill the rest of the tool out.
Totally agree. Totally agree. And this is why, like, I'm really glad you guys have questions. I love it because I prefer to do it that way. But I didn't anticipate spending quite so much time on SROI because it's not, look, if I had to choose a tool in the toolbox, this is probably not my favorite tool. But, you know, in certain circumstances, I can see that it adds value. It, you know, makes things consistent as far as they can be consistent for people who are looking to fund programs and compare across programs. And some of the principles that underpin it, like I mentioned, you know, the one where it's driven entirely by what stakeholders are saying is great. But yeah, I wouldn't, there's a lot of assumptions. There's a lot of drawing things all the way through from, you know, maybe an offhand statement that a family made, and then trying to draw that all the way through this, which may at the end of the day, with all of the kind of equations behind it, end up in an odd, you know, unintended, you know, weight being given to this kind of offhand comment, you know. So there's a lot of challenges, I think, with the framework, but there is with, you know, most frameworks and how we measure outcomes. Chloe, did you have something you wanted?
So as a social enterprise and the accreditation around being a social enterprise, I need to actually quantify that a minimum 50% of our value has actually gone into our purpose. So I'm looking at how this system could be used to actually demonstrate not only our our commitment to our social impact, but they were able to actually back it up with the figures.
Yeah, I probably wouldn't use SROI for that. I think, just being able to quantify 50% of your profit going into the mission would be a matter of being clear on what your outcomes are as an organisation, and what the expenditure for those is related to those outcomes. So you could, have a look at the indicators there. But I think that would be much easier to evidence and a better process and cheaper and, less tenuous than an SROI analysis for sure. But we'll go through some of the other methodologies in a moment. I'll just get to Joe's question. There was a look at programs happening in Roebourne, which looked at an ROI. No, it wasn't an SROI. So what that was, it was something that the state government contracted, which was a little bit more focused, I think, on kind of a stock take of programs. And so around that time, there was this language coming out around, the state government spend on, there's more community services per head of the, I can't remember, there was some weird stat that they were using about the sector. And, I say weird stat, that's terrible. I'm sure that the statistic was based in truth somewhere, but there was something about an extraordinary amount being spent per head of the population in Roebourne just because of all of the investment in community services there. Yeah, great. There we go, Liz. There are 127 programs in Roebourne for less than 1,000 people. So that was more of a stock take and an understanding of what program funding was, and then dividing that by head of the population rather than something that looks like an SROI analysis. So it was, same language, but a bit different. All right, I'm going to move us on away from SROI to results-based accountability. So has anyone heard of this as a methodology? Yep, a couple. So this one effectively asks the three questions that are on the screen here. So how much did we do? How well did we do it? And is anyone better off? And RBA then, uses these kind of indicators underneath these broad question statements. And I'm giving you a super quick flyover because there's actually a lot that sits underneath this. So, people that are using RBA actually have kind of this consistent reporting around turning the curves. They've got an understanding of where they want to be, and sometimes weekly, fortnightly, however often it is, people in the organisation will receive an update on where they're at in terms of the key outcomes that they've identified and where they're at in terms of these three key areas. RBA is quite good because all of the materials are freely available online. Having said that though, most of the organisations that I've seen using it and implementing it often are larger and or have a resource dedicated to actually implementing it. So I've never directly implemented it myself, but that evidence suggests to me that perhaps it's not quite as straightforward as, hey, all of the stuff's online, just go nuts on it. What I really do like about RBA is this question of how well did we do it? So I think sometimes that quality stuff can get a little bit missed when we're talking about outcomes measurement. And the is anyone better off is kind of, outcomesy language. But that how well did we do it as a question sometimes gets a bit lost, I think. And so, often we measure outputs of participation and were people satisfied, but that's kind of it. It doesn't really delve much more into that. So that's RBA. Super quick flyover. Has anyone got questions on RBA? So you can see now how actually much time I thought we were going to spend on SROI, but we spent more. But that's okay, it's no problem. And then most significant change, has anyone heard of this one? Some? Yeah. So MSC is a storytelling type approach effectively. And I think, Emma actually says it in the workshops that we do, but no stories without data, no data without stories. So you can't really understand stories, you can't really understand the data without a story that helps you understand what the data is telling you. And most oftentimes, really, people don't listen to the data without a story attached to it. So MSC, it's actually quite technical, and I don't think I have the diagram here, no. But it's an ordered, very structured way of collecting stories. So you often have people at different sites. They collect stories from people who have been impacted by the program, service, organisation, and then they aggregate up, and then there's usually a selection process of organisations going through and selecting the stories that articulates the most significant change that's been made for, for the organisation, client, whatever it is. I think MSC is really, it's not a standalone methodology, so you wouldn't say, hey, like we measure our organisation's impact with most significant change. But it's a really critical picture, and I think most organisations practically know that, because when we're doing our reports for government or funders or whoever, we will usually put some stories in there at the same time. But an example of where it was useful is before Lottery West put in their new community investment framework. I think it might have been back in 2014 or 2016 or something. They actually did an MSC evaluation. I use that very loosely. But because Lottery West, right, at the time didn't have a community investment framework, and so would invest in, not anything, but a lot of things, and so being able to understand the impact of all of that, the way that they chose to try and do that was through most significant change. So just an interesting illustration, I guess, of how to put that in practice. Okay, so that's just 3 methodologies for measuring. I haven't gone through every single one that exists, but they're kind of the 3 common ones I think that we often see, well, at least in WA across the sectors. If someone's using a methodology, often it could be one of those. Has anyone got any questions or comments or additional methodologies they'd like to share with everyone else?
I find that RBA really quite useful as a bit of a 101 tool for staff. So coming into the organisation we're around now, that there wasn't much knowledge around how to measure anything, so we used that as a bit of a 101 and then applied it to the different strategic objectives that we had. So that was a really good learning tool. I often like to start with a program logic that determines my outcomes. I might then use a bit of RBA to work out the indicators, and then an evaluation framework to work out the questions I'm going to ask to be able to answer the indicators to inform us if we're actually achieving the outcomes, and then look for evidence-based tools, just the stuff. So.
No, I think that's really useful, Craig. I think that's yeah, I mean, I'm probably quite similar in the way that you're talking. I like to do the same. Start with a logic model, so you've got a clear understanding of what the outcomes are, because once you kind of know that, you can kind of retrofit. If you really want to use a tool or methodology, you can retrofit your outcomes into most of them. So starting there, I think, is a really good place of starting. Liz has a question. Any strong RBA examples that are publicly available? We use one when we do a face-to-face workshop, so I'll see if I can find that and send it out. I actually forget who it is. But I also know that in WA, Anglicare uses RBA and has been using it for some time, and I think does make some of their learning available around that. And for a period of time, the neighbourhood centres, so LinkQuest, which is the peak body for community resource centres and neighbourhood centres, or centres as a whole, they at one point, Department of Communities decided that they would use RBA for evaluating all of those services. So those guys were all using RBA for a time, so there could be something available on the LinkQuest website as well. Does anyone else know publicly available things? So frustrating, because even when you do evaluations and such, the amount of people willing to make that publicly available is challenging.
I'll just put a link to, I can't remember the guy's name, I can't believe it's not coming, Mark Friedman.
Yeah.
That's the RBA. Yeah.
Friedman.
Spent a bit of time with him, he's pretty funny, really. But I'll put that link if that's going to help.
Yeah, cool. That'd be great, Craig. Oh, I can make the chat available to everyone afterwards as well. And Kristen's just dumped a link in there from an essay-based example as well, which is really cool.
Yeah, it's got the mark. It's got the marked material in there too. I think.
Oh, amazing! Great.
Excellent.
Awesome. Yeah, so look at that, resource sharing. That's awesome. And if you guys have anything else that you think of after the workshop, I can make it available to everyone else when I send the email out. So just send any resources you'd like shared with everyone through. Okay, last little bit, and luckily, because we're nearly out of time. So using frameworks to organise. So, I didn't really talk about this at the beginning, and I should have. So the Impact Management Project is an international project. It's more from the field of impact investment, but it's focused on creating consistent global language and frameworks around measuring impact. The reason why they use impact management, and the reason why I've tried to start using more of the language of impact management in my own practice, is because I think oftentimes we can fall into the, I guess, the folly of measuring, but then maybe not actually doing anything with that information. And I know some of this is obviously, you know, we're constrained by resources and analytic capability and a whole bunch of other things, right? But impact management kind of, to me, has this sense of, yeah, where we've got we understand our outcomes, we understand the change that we're making, and we're actually making changes to our program service organization based on what the data is telling us, you know, so we're managing our impact. We're acknowledging that impact can be positive and negative, and in fact, you know, probably every organization person probably does a little bit of each. So it's not just that we're always positively striving for positive impact, but we're thinking about how we manage our negative impact as well. And so I just like that approach. I think it's quite strong, and it's, you know, got that emphasis on analysis and how we use the data that we're measuring, not just that we're measuring, right? So the IMP project has these 5 dimensions of impact. So the what, the who, the how much, the contribution, and the risk. And as you can see, I don't believe it's all, you know, impact investment only focused, right? I think these things are broadly applicable to looking at other community services stuff. So that's the dimensions of the project. And then this is the intentions. So what I really like about the IMP is that it tries to divide the kinds of intentions that you have in understanding and managing impact and divides them into different areas. So you've got don't consider impact. So this is obviously for probably a lot of business as usual. So being aware of potential negative impact, but not really thinking about how it's being mitigated. Now we've got the red circles, so organisations, so social enterprises, businesses. I think all community services really are in the yellow and orange, but, you know, this is a framework that's applying for more, I guess, businesses looking to be more ethical and responsible and stuff as well. So avoiding harm. So then I've got requirements I want to meet. I want to mitigate my risk. I want to behave responsibly, through to actually you know, am a business or want to support businesses that are actually doing good and making impact for people and planet, and then through to contributing to solutions, so actually solving these big, you know, wicked problems. So I just like the way that the IMP maps those things, and the dimensions of impact is the word I'm looking for. Directly kind of, they've got different standards of evidence, you know, based on which intention your business or your enterprise or your NFP is kind of looking at. And, oh, I thought I had one more thing to say about IMP. Oh, no, that's right. I was going to show it to you. Huh. So there's a few different ways to use IMP. But it is, so the one I've got here for you is for an enterprise, because it's the kind of workshop we're in, right? There's actually different ways for fund managers, for other people to measure impact in different ways. This one's focused on individual enterprises and how they measure impact. And as you can see, it's quite similar to what we've seen with the other logic behind the other frameworks we've talked about. So you've got, we're going to figure out what the impact is, what are the indicators, what's the data that we need, what is the source of that data, and overall what's the assessment. And they break the dimensions down into particular areas to be able to think about. The reason I like the structure behind this is I think for people that are new to impact management, impact measurement, it gives them a lot of guidance. So you can really think about each of these elements. And, you know, you wouldn't then use all of the indicators, right? But you'd pick out probably the most relevant ones. But it gives a lot of guidance, which I think can be useful for people who are just starting out. And it's just eminently sensible. I found this framework quite sensible. So IMP is one, and I'll again send this out when I send you guys the email and the slides, but I'll send that out as well. But there's a lot of other stuff on the website that's worth looking at. Let's get back. Great. Okay. The role of SDGs and outcomes hierarchies generally. So sustainable development goals, you probably are all mostly aware of sustainable development goals. So they are the antecedent, I think antecedent's the right word, of the Millennium Development Goals, the UN kind of orientation towards goals we're achieving as a world. A lot of investors, philanthropists, and fund managers are finding these very interesting at the moment. We're seeing a lot of people wanting to align things to SDGs. From a social enterprise and community services organisation point of view, therefore it could be interesting to think about what role we as organisations have towards the SDGs and how we might measure that. I think one of the challenges is that oftentimes people are just looking at the pretty little tiles and thinking, well, I work in education, so I definitely contribute to number 4, quality education. You know, fund managers doing this sort of stuff as well. I think really we want to be looking at these. So all of these, if you think about them as kind of domain areas, have a series of outcomes underneath them, and then have a series of indicators that consistent indicators that everyone's working towards. So it's worth delving into to see if any of those indicators can be useful to you in creating your own frameworks or improving your own frameworks. This is an example of one of our partners. So this is an impact investment firm and how they actually map their investments to the SDGs. And so it's just a good example, I think, of what funders and investors are looking for. And if they are able to roll up effectively the kind of data, aggregate the kind of data from all the different investments that they're making to this kind of pretty picture, then that's useful. I make fun. I actually think it's useful to try to aggregate impact as well and understand what's happening at a system level. I'm poking fun a bit because it is, you know, it makes it look very simple, right? Very pretty. I might skip over this one. It's kind of just how to, but I might just leave that with you to have a little look at in your own time if that's useful. If you are to start looking at mapping some of your activity, or just think about how some of the elements of the SDG framework could be useful to you, that is just kind of an example of how you might do that. So I might leave that with you. Jenny, have you raised your hand?
I have.
Oh, great. Awesome.
Because it's so much easier to do that than to try and type and listen to you at the same time, from a neuroscience point of view. About 75% of the grants currently available to not-for-profits, and I'm talking non-government grants, so from family offices and other such organisations, now go through equity trustees and perpetual, and they are quite strongly leaning towards SDGs rather than anything else. I mean, their questions encompass a lot of the other measurement tools, but they're increasingly focused on SDGs. And what I'm finding is no one's actually doing it down at that level you were talking about, and it's quite superficial. But the fact that you're even considering that and starting to work towards it seems to put you ahead of the rest of the group. And if you're not actually mapping to SDGs, and you're really narrowing your grant pool to only being able to apply for 25% of the available grants for not-for-profits.
Totally. Thanks, Jenny. I think it's a really good point. I was being a bit flippant about it, but it is actually true. Mike, did you have something to say too?
Yeah, just having started a not-for-profit 7 years ago, but also being on the board of one and worked with many, it would be a PhD to take the SDGs and look at the constitutions and missions of not-for-profits, because the objects that are written into the constitutions that govern what an organisation is for and its purpose are quite often lost in the mists of time, tradition. It's what was the case when they were founded 30 years ago and so on. It'd be really interesting to say that a mental health not-for-profit that works with called populations actually talked about equity and opportunity, discrimination and harassment, not just mental health. And you know, that would be a really good way for funders to also look at not-for-profits to sort of say, well, you know, are you a fit for the way the whole system works, not just a fit for a slice? It's a very small slice sometimes.
Totally. It's a good point, Michael. I think, like, I really like Jenny's point also, because we're really both of you both make excellent points. But the idea of how we mapping to people who are giving money, but then Michael's point around, well, actually, how are we doing that also in a way that's meaningful? Because I think as Jenny said, it's not super, sometimes it's quite, you know, superficial, and it's quite on the surface, and we're not really thinking about it. But if we're actually looking at organisations like Michael's talking about, who are actually making really significant impacts in, you know, if I go backwards, like, you know, some of these, where is it? peace and justice and strong institutions. Like if we think about reduced inequality, some of the work that organizations do and how they fit into these may be somewhat more esoteric, but like world values and how really it's actually making a contribution to that, that's powerful. But to Jenny's point, I don't know that anyone's actually thinking about it in that level of like depth, right? Which is a shame. So it's equally an opportunity and just something to kind of think about and be aware of. And a lot of the SDGs are, well, I won't say that. I think they're all relevant for Australia. I think some of the indicators underneath each of them are more relevant for developing countries than developed countries. So it's also just being aware of that. Where was I? I'm going to skip over that. It's just another example really of mapping to the IMP framework. So these examples are all just sort of I guess case examples of how they're using the frameworks that we've talked about to be able to talk about their investments. I want to just touch on WA outcomes measurement framework. So this is a project that I finished last year, or phase 1 of the development was finished last year with the Western Australian Council of Social Service, or WACOS, with Department of Premier and Cabinet, Treasury and Department of Finance. And so the idea was to create an outcomes measurement framework that not only community services organisations can use across the board, but that eventually could look to be a whole of government kind of way of thinking about things. With COVID, obviously, a lot of the kind of government priorities that were there have been put to one side. I know that the progress on this is still developing, albeit a lot more slowly, but for those of you in WA, it's just worth noting, and I'll make a copy of this framework available when I send the documents out. The reason I bring it up is because obviously it's framed in outcomes, and there's indicators that sit underneath this as well. And if I show you that, so we've got for each of the domains, we've got all of these sort of population level outcomes, some sub outcomes that's been mapped to, and then indicators and measures. And if there's a WA data source or WA targets and goals, they've been mapped into there as well. And so we've done that for each domain. I'm not going to pretend it's perfect. It still needs a lot of development, but it's a starting point, and I think it's a good starting point for looking at also how we have consistent language across the sector, because I think even if we can't get to a point of standardization, and probably nor would we want to, I think we can definitely get to a point of being more consistent and having a broader common understanding of outcomes that we're trying to achieve. This was another state government priority, our priorities that has been put to one side for now. But once again, I think it's just worth noting because of the targets that sit underneath them. And even in a post-COVID environment, we've seen them start to pick up again some of these, like particularly around a bright future. So I think, these probably will come back to the fore again at some point. So worth being aware of that. Once again, there's another spot within WA. Sorry to those who are from other places, but within WA, a place where we've got some attention and, concerted effort on, achieving these kinds of targets that have indicators that sit underneath them. So just worth, if it is relevant for you, trying to incorporate that into your frameworks and practice if possible. And then we just mapped our priorities to the framework. So that is all of the stuff that I had to talk to you about. Does anyone have any questions? Dominique? Oh, that's a clappy hand, not a question hand. Yeah, okay. Great, thank you. Yeah, Max.
You probably won't know this at all, but like in terms of the development of that framework, what's your estimated time that is going to be, is likely to take to be endorsed? A year?
As you all know, COVID really, stuck a pin in things, didn't it? Yeah, they've employed someone to do the further development. How long? I don't know. I don't know how long. I'd be, just keeping an eye on it. I think that there's something. I mean, I do everything I can in whatever role I'm in to kind of push it and make things happen. But I think looking at it again in 6 months is worthwhile. But honestly, it just depends how long state government is distracted by different kinds of coordinating bodies to deal with COVID. So.
Yeah.
I wonder if you can, so with the Western Australian outcomes framework and how the indicators and, the whole map in there, that was really great. They've recently done one for children and young people in South Australia, and they also included the types of evidence-based, or the word's just escaping me, it must be that time of day, of tools that you can use to actually report against those outcomes and indicators.
Okay.
I wondered if they'd thought about or added that level of detail just yet.
Yeah, so when when we did the first phase of development, I pulled in all the work that was done from other jurisdictions. So here in WA, we've got a Commissioner for Children and Young People that has an index of wellbeing, which is quite extensive. So some of that was pulled in, but not all of it, because I guess the framework didn't want to replace things that already existed. So the idea, I guess, at least in WA, was to just create a bit of an umbrella which these other things could sit under and map to. So then over time, when things are redeveloped and strategies are reformed, they use that consistent language. But CCYP in WA was really relevant and actually, you know, super outcomes based anyway. So that was relatively easy to just map to. So we drew in what was relevant and then mapped to. But yeah, anything that's been developed, you know, this year or even second half of last year probably wouldn't have been, it was before that, the development. So it probably hasn't been considered. Yeah. Any other questions? Megan, did you want to?
I was just interested in what the next session, part 2.
Oh, sorry, it's in the chat. I had your name in mind for a question. Yeah, so what I had originally envisaged was actually to do the content we've done, but you know, more of it, and do it, you know, with a lot more activities and practical things. Because I've decided to kind of divide it into 2 parts and do, I guess, the content delivery stuff now. Part 2, the intention is probably to just flesh out on some of the concepts. So what I'm currently thinking, and I haven't prepared it yet because, you know, we're thinking August or later, probably what I would do is contact everyone and do a pre-survey and get a sense of, okay, now that we've got the definitional and foundational concepts kind of taken care of, hopefully, where do we want to spend the time, and figure out what the kind of 3 chunky things are from there, and actually use the chance to be face-to-face to work on that. The other thing, though, that part 2 will have, which I think would be really interesting, is I obviously divided this group out from the corporate group, but the idea will be to bring them together in the workshop. So I'll probably also have a think about how do we create an environment where we can be, I guess, learning from each other, right? Corporates and corporate investment, and, you know, the social enterprises and NFPs they're investing in. So just have to think that through a little bit more. That's early thoughts.
I don't know if it helps, but one of the guys that heads up the responsible investors strategy with Morgan Stanley brought together a group of NFPs and a few investors as well, and that was a really useful afternoon.
Was that in WA, Craig, or no?
No, South Australia.
Yeah.
Sorry, but
no, we had something similar happen here. I don't know if it was Morgan Stanley, but someone brought together some orgs to talk a bit more about responsible investment, impact investment. But yeah, I think like there was some useful things to take from that experience. Yeah. For sure.
It's pretty amazing. Not just the fact that they've got a kitchen there. Our small NGOs don't quite have, well, I shouldn't say a kitchen, like a full chef in there.
Yeah, I think the one I went to, that we had these beautiful lunch boxes and they had champagne on the table. And I was like, guys, no one's going to get into that. And they're like, people get into it at our meetings. And I was like, what? Yeah. Crazy. Yeah. Any other questions at all? No? All right. Oh, Jenny, you got a hand up.
No, it was just thanking you.
Oh, cool. Thank you. And thank all of you for being here. And I'll make sure we distribute some information as well as the slides, hopefully this afternoon. Please, just if you can do the survey. I like to try and practice what I preach. So yeah, it will be very short, but if you could fill it in when it comes, that'd be great. Thanks, everyone. Have a good afternoon. See you.
Thanks.